anywhere from 60 to 65% of the cells of the heart are actually neural cells, just as you find in the brain. They gather in ganglia rather than the larger fields of the brain, but essentially in the same function, which John and Beatrice Lacey researched for 30 years under the auspices of the National Institutes of Health, and came up with this direct, unmediated neural connection, direct pipeline between the heart and the brain. The fact that there's an ongoing 24-hour-a-day dialogue between the heart and the brain. The three phases of the heartbeat each creates its own initial part of this field effect that surrounds the body. And the first one is very short, but the next one is about 3 feet out, and it's very powerful. They find that they can take a perfectly clear EKG, or electrocardiogram, 3 feet away from the body. You don't have to touch the body. And then, of course, it goes on out 12 to 15 feet away at least. That's easily detectable, and we know now that it goes even further, and all these fields interact one with another. But the critical part for me is the fact that the field that extends out about 3 feet beyond the body is a very powerful field. And you get two of those fields next to each other, and they're going to interact, which gets into the whole issue of mother-child relationships, because that field effect and the overlapping of the field effect created by the heart, each individual heart, is where a great deal of very important information lies. We know, for instance, in the new research that's just come out recently, that the mother's emotional state, which translates directly as what the heart frequency is doing in that mother, determines the shape, character, nature, and quality of the growth of the brain, its neural cells, its capacities in utero. Now comes Alan Shore's work showing that the mother's emotional state and the coherency or incoherency of her heart profoundly affects the infant in the state after birth, particularly the first 9 months, and that her coherent heart frequency or realm of influence, which we would refer to as her emotional state, determines whether or not the latest evolutionary addition of the brain, the prefrontal lobes, actually grow or not. That is, the cellular structure, whether the cellular structure is fully developed or not in that infant, depends on the mother's own emotional state, which means the state of her heart. Is it coherent or incoherent to begin with? When the infant is separated from the mother's heart, you have an incoherent frequency. So there can't be entrainment until the infant's heart is brought back into coherency. What brings it back into coherency is its immediate adjacent relationship to the mother's heart. And so her heart lifts the infant's heart out of its incoherent mode into a coherent mode, and then they go into entrainment. When you speak of entrainment of the heart, you're speaking of a very precise, measurable, simply a scientific fact, that the amplitude and the Hertz value of the heart frequencies is coherent. And if that is, then the infant brought into that frame of work will very quickly reflect that coherence. And then you find that they go into exactly the same type of frequency rhythms, which means they entrain. You could say the waveforms match, so there's no dissonance. When waveforms don't match, we speak of dissonance. If you're listening to a piece of music and all the waveforms are harmonic, then we hear harmony. And if they should suddenly someone go haywire, we hear dissonance. And the same thing with the entrainment between the mother's heart and the infant's heart. Now this brings about a whole raft of other things. We find that if the infant's heart and the mother's heart are entrained, the brain structures go into entrainment as well. Those frequencies go into entrainment. Now that entrained state keeps everything coherent and in perfect balance. And that is what we refer to as bonding between mother and infant. Later on, we find this bonding extending out, this ability to entrain with your environment. And the child entrains with their family. And there's harmony in that family because they're all on essentially the same frequency. Failing the initial bond with the mother, all subsequent bonding is not only put at risk, but is very difficult to bring about. And the failure of a child to bond socially and become an active member of the society is not the child's moral, ethical failure. It's the failure of having established that bond in the beginning on which the later social bonds must be built. And the Harvard study showed clearly that one reflected this throughout life, both in one's health and ability to interact socially with other people. Alan Shore spends a great deal of time and 2,300 research citations to show how the first 18 months of life determine all subsequent moves of intelligence, capacities to relate for the rest of one's life. Why? Because those neural structures for that have to grow in the first 18 months of life, and they grow according to the experience the child is given on an emotional level. And the most interesting thing about Shore's work is he spends the first half of the book on the first 18 months of life, and then he gets into the pathologies that he finds in teenagers and the adult. And he traces all the pathologies in the teenagers and the adults back to the failure of the appropriate emotional state given the child in the first 18 months of life. So there we go. Antonio Damasio, one of our brilliant neuroscientists, pointed out that no matter how brilliant you might have a neocortical structure, the human brain up on top, what we think of as our intellectual creative brain, that it is critically dependent on the emotional cognitive system, that the high human brain is limited by the limitations of the emotional cognitive brain. Our cognition itself is limited by the emotional system. So if you want to develop higher levels of intelligence in a child, you must first of all have a thoroughly developed emotional cognitive system in that child, or you have no foundation to move on into the higher levels of human intelligence. And it's on this very basis that our whole educational system has been falling apart. Our whole social system is falling apart. Our family systems are falling apart because they're, you might say, higher evolutionary intelligence is involved, and we're failing to put in that fundamental foundation of the emotional security, the safe space, the bonding of that infant with its mother. Actually from conception on, that bond must be made.